welcome back to my living room studio. We are going to talk about verbal elements of communication. Aren't all elements of communication verbal? Well, actually, as you will see, not all elements of communication are verbal, but we're going to save that part for another chapter. For this chapter, we're going to explore a couple of things. First, we'll talk about how language works. Then we'll talk about the functions, the impact, and the types of language, as well as improving verbal communication. So why do we say what we do? What is language? Language is a system of human communication, using a particular form of spoken or written words or other symbols. The most important element of human communication is, you guessed it, verbal communication. And discourse means any discussion of a subject, either in written or in spoken form. So, why do we choose the words that we choose? First is the semantic rules, which are the dictionary definition of the word, also called the denotative meaning. Then there are syntactic rules, including the grammar, structure, and punctuation. And then there are pragmatic rules, how individuals interpret messages based on the communicative interaction. These are also called connotative meanings. So this is the meaning given to words outside of what you would find in the dictionary. So what do our words convey? Well, our words can help create reality. The words can reflect an individual's attitudes about things, positive or negative ways an individual perceives them, and words and messages that vary in abstraction. So here's kind of an abstract ladder for you. So if we started with the abstract and got down to concrete, right? So the abstract would be information that's available to us, then research, then academic fields, humanities and social sciences, communication studies, and then specifically interpersonal communication. So as you can see, we go from the more abstract idea of information down to the more concrete idea of actually talking about interpersonal communication. So what do we think about the messages we send? Meta-communication is communicating about communication. So if you're in a relationship and you're talking about the relationship with the other person or a couple of people who are in the relationship, that's called meta-communication. You're communicating about the communication. So if you were talking about how you communicated with other people in your relationship and you're saying, well, I don't think we communicate very well. We don't talk about finances. We don't talk about what we want to do on the weekends. We don't talk about etc., right? That's meta communication. Then meta messages involve the meaning conveyed beyond the words themselves. So this also includes things like the feelings between you and the other person. Are you connected well? Are you just sort of connected? How good do you know the other person? Mindfulness helps individuals decode meta messages. And misunderstandings occur when individuals associate different meanings with the same message. Here we again look at denotative meaning, which is the dictionary definition, and connotative meaning, a subjective definition of the word, incorporating its emotional impact. So what function does language address? Instruments and regulatory functions, interactional and imaginative functions, personal functions, ritual functions, heuristic and representational functions, and cultural functions. So language has a lot of functions or a lot of pieces wrapped up into it. Now remember, language in this situation does not only mean English. It can mean all sorts of languages, like some of the languages that I know, right? It could include English, Spanish, sign language, Swahili, German, etc. There are instrumental and regulatory functions. Instrumental functions are the use of language to fulfill a need, manipulating and controlling your environment, and expressing your feelings. These were the ones that we were really good at when we were babies. We just communicated through our verbal language that we knew at the time, which was mostly babble, that we needed something. As a baby, what do you need? Things like food or drink, right? You want to be held, or you need to be changed. Regulatory functions are when the language is used to influence another's behavior through the use of requests, rules, or persuasion. So this is when we advanced a little bit. Now I know I'm using simple examples, but it's true. When we advanced a little bit into our toddlership, this is when we used our language to try to convince people to give us things or to get us things. Interactional or imaginative functions. Interactional functions of language help to form and maintain relationships. Imaginative functions use the language to help create imaginary constructs that don't exist in the real world. So this is when you are throwing around ideas, brainstorming, trying to come up with something that doesn't already exist that you think could exist in the world. What function does language address? Okay, again, we're going to talk about some of the functions. This time, personal functions, ritual functions, and heuristic and representational functions. So, personal functions, the use of language to help individuals form their identity or sense of self. We really elaborated a lot on identity and sense of self in the previous chapter, so I won't spend a lot of time on that here. Ritual functions, though, are when language is used out of habit without thinking about it. These are the things that we've been socialized or taught to learn. I mentioned those also in the last chapter, but this is the habit of using language. I moved here from Minnesota to Colorado, and some of the words that I use or some of the ways that I say those words are different from the way that other people here in Colorado use them. And that's my use of language without thinking about it. It's a habit. Sometimes I have to clarify myself so that other people understand what I'm saying. This could happen to anyone who moves to a different location or goes to visit a different location. The heuristic and representational functions. Heuristic functions, use of language to explore and investigate the world, solve problems, and learn from your discoveries and experiences. Representational functions, language is used to represent objects and ideas and express one's thoughts. So in this situation, we're actually giving names to things. We're actually talking about things. When a desk was invented, it wasn't called a desk. Somebody had to come up with the name for it. When a computer was invented, it was not called a computer until someone came up with the language and the words to represent what that thing was. Again, more functions of language. Cultural functions include the language represents one's culture in terms of semantics and syntactics. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that language impacts perceptions by showing a culture's worldview. Linguistic determinism, the perspective that language influences one's thoughts. And linguistic relativity, the view that language contains special characteristics influencing one's emotions. For example, again, the way that I might use terms in English are different than my friends who speak sign language, are different than my friends who speak Spanish. And when I try to use some of my words with them, even when I'm trying to speak Swahili and people look at me funny, it's probably because I use the word differently than they would, having been raised in that culture. I wasn't raised in that culture, so I don't exactly know how to apply the words other than the way that they mean to me, somebody who's a native speaker of English. People think that sign language is just signing every word that someone would say in English, but actually it is signing some of the words. It is not signed spoken English. It is its own language in its entirety. And we don't only have American Sign Language. There's actually sign language in every country of the world. And even in the United States, it has different dialects. So, how powerful are those languages, or the words within the languages, no matter which language it is? Language impacts other people's emotions. A person's name is very important. You should learn how to pronounce a person's name. I particularly try to learn how to pronounce the names of the students within my classroom. In fact, sometimes I'm learning 100 names per semester. But I continue to remember those names for a very long time beyond that. And I use those people's names because they are very attached to that. That is the name that they were given by their parents. It shows one's affiliation. Your surname shows your affiliation with your family or families. So, coverage, adapting to one's communication style to be similar to others. Divergence is adapting one's communication style to differ from others. Bias are the attitudes that are not objective, prejudiced, or offensive to others. Bias, like sexism, is against others based on their biological sex, and racism is bias against other people based on their race or ethnicity. So bias itself is not necessarily a bad word, but when we apply it to certain people or certain situations, then it can become an ism, sexism, racism, ageism, and we are applying things that may not apply to each person who is part of the group. So there is muted group theory. How do words define societal views? So muted group theory talks about dominating members of a social society, creating a communication system that subverts or reduces other groups. You could look at this typically with a men and women, right? People who are more masculine tend to dominate the people who are more feminine. We can also look at it in terms of race. If you believe that there's one group that is more dominant than another group, and the dominant group keeps the lesser group quiet. So here, the dominant group views their own perceptions as reality. The muted group's perception of reality is viewed as less or more fanciful than the dominant group's perception. As I mentioned, here in Fort Morgan, we have a lot of different people from a lot of different places around the world. So we don't really have a dominant group, but I also mentioned that even though there are 24 different languages spoken every day, there are two that are most dominant. One is English and the second one is Spanish. So if you are not speaking in one of those languages, you might feel like your ideas are less important than the dominant group. That's not exactly true, but that is how we do feel as members of minority groups. In reality, muted groups sees that things exist in society that the dominant group cannot or will not observe or acknowledge. So there are contributions, absolutely, that the minority group can and does make to every society. So even though there is a muted group theory, and it is possible in plenty of situations, there is importance for the muted group or the minority group. They need to bring to the dominant group ideas from their perspective. So what types of language do you use? Formal language is official or academic language. Informal language is common and what we use every day. Jargon is specialized or technical language associated with a specific group or professional context that may not be understood by outsiders. And colloquialisms are informal expressions used in casual conversation specific to certain dialects or geographic regions of the country. For example, colloquialisms, where I was raised in Minnesota, we call the food hot dish. Most other places in the United States refer to it as casserole. It takes me a lot of effort to remember to use the term casserole. If I'm just riding on autopilot, remember the habit thing, I will automatically refer to it as hot dish. This is an example of a colloquialism. Slang, idioms, and cliches are other types of language that we use. So slang is non-standard language of a culture or subculture. Idioms are figures of speech whose meaning cannot be understood by interpreting individual words literally. And then cliches are overused expressions that have lost their original meaning. An idiom might be, it's raining cats and dogs. We can't literally take that apart and make it make any sense. But in the United States, we generally know that means it's raining really hard outside. So this almost becomes cliche because it is an overused expression. What message does improper language communicate? So if you are using vulgar words, cursing, biased language, or spin, this might communicate your message differently than you had intended. Vulgarity is language that is offensive or lacks good taste. Cursing is curse or profane language that projects evil, doom, or misfortune on a person or group. Biased language is language showing preference in favor of or against a certain point of view, showing prejudice, or demeaning to others. And spin is a manipulation of language to achieve the positive interpretation of words, to gain a political advantage, or to deceive others. So cursing, my mom always told us we were only allowed to use one curse word at home, and that's because I grew up on a dairy farm and we had a lot of shit. But we were only to use it when we were using it literally. Otherwise, we had to come up with more creative ways to say that we were frustrated with something. The spin here, as it's used here, usually applies to the news. In particular, the way that they spin some of the news stories to gain a political advantage, not always to deceive others, but the word spin in relation to news and news publications or news on TV, news that you see on the internet, any of these have had or do have spin. It's been that way forever. So we need to, when we're consuming media, focus on finding the least biased information possible. There's also ambiguous language, euphemisms, relative language, and static evaluation. So ambiguous language is when abstract language is used in multiple meanings, when multiple meanings may be present. So this is like saying it's really big. Well, how big is it? What are we comparing it to? That's fairly ambiguous or abstract language. Euphemism is when there's a way of saying something more politely or less bluntly. I was telling the high school students I was subbing for last week that when I don't really want to give away what I think of someone, I might say, they're very interesting. Then you don't really know whether I like them or I don't like them, whether I think of them positively or negatively. I just say, that person's really interesting. Then there's relative language, language that gains understanding by comparison. And the static evaluation is language shows that people and things change over time. Just like I was talking about the word spin earlier, although it has always applied to media, it does not mean the same thing as the spin maybe in the 1800s or the early 1900s as it does in the late 1900s or early 2000s. How can you improve your communication skills, verbal communication skills in particular? Vocabulary is a predictor of one's social status, education, and profession. So the more words you learn, you may learn words from Word of the Day, you might learn them from your textbooks, you might learn them from talking to your instructors. So if you want to improve your vocabulary skills, repetition. You might group similar words together. I just gave you some ideas of how to build your vocabulary, and to build your vocabulary, reading can always help with that. As I mentioned in my other video, I did teach my son how to talk when he was about 2 years old, and he knows a lot of words that other people his age do not use, but it's because I always talk to him using those words. I never used baby talk with him. I hardly simplified the words. I just explained to him what they meant, and he started using them. You can also improve your verbal communication skills by increasing your awareness and adaptation of language. The more you are aware of language and how we use language, the better you are at adjusting it based on the situation. And you can adapt your language to fit in different situations. I don't always use the academic language that I use with my colleagues when I am at college. Sometimes I just use colloquial language like everybody else, or I discuss things at a different level using different vocabulary depending on the situation that I'm in. I don't use all of the college terminology when I'm substitute teaching high school, or when I'm talking to kids from elementary school. I'm not using formal language as much as I might if I was talking to my college students. How do you improve your communication skills? You want to check for understanding with the people that you're talking to. So talk first, then ask questions, and be prepared to listen. Or vice versa, you can listen, ask questions, and then provide an answer. Either way, it is checking for an understanding from you or the other person or people that you're communicating with. Can you improve communication skills? The good news is yes. Do we all know how to improve our communication skills? Not necessarily. That's why you're taking a class like this one, so that you can improve your interpersonal interactions no matter what setting you find yourself in.